They left her in the canyon to die, a widow with nothing but a fraying quilt and a crying baby in her arms. The cliffs rose like gravestones around her, the wind tearing at her shawl as night fell. She whispered promises she did not believe, certain no one would come. But then, the sound of hooves echoed through the stone. A lone rider emerged from the shadows, his face hidden beneath a weathered hat, rifle across his back. He spoke no word, yet in that silence her fate changed forever, for in the Wild West, salvation often came from a stranger with no name. The canyon walls stretched like jagged tombstones, black against the fading amber sky. Eliza's shawl whipped about her shoulders as the wind carried dust down from the cliffs, stinging her cheeks and filling the air with grit. She sat upon the cold ground, her back pressed against the boulder that shielded her from the worst of the gusts, her newborn bundled tight in a patchwork quilt that smelled faintly of smoke and milk. The quilt had been her mother's, the only piece of home left to her. She held it tight now, though the fabric was fraying, threads pulled loose like unraveling years. The child whimpered, a thin desperate cry that echoed against the stone. Each sound pierced her heart. She hushed him, rocking gently though her arms ached from fatigue. Her lips pressed to his forehead, damp with the chill of evening. She whispered words she did not fully believe, promises of safety, of tomorrow, of warmth yet to come. But in the hollow of her chest, fear pressed heavier than the canyon shadows. Her in-laws had left her here that morning, voices sharp with condemnation. A burden, they had called her. No place for a widow who brings only mouths to feed. They had taken the mule, the wagon, and the grain, and had ridden away without turning back. Eliza had begged, clutched her child closer, pleaded that the babe deserved mercy if she did not. But their eyes were stone. Their backs, disappearing into the dust, were the last human forms she had seen all day. The sun slipped low. Darkness crept into the canyon, carrying with it a silence thick as sorrow. Only the baby's cry remained, mingling with the wind's lonely whistle. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little against the cold. Her body shook, not only from the chill, but from the memory of her husband's grave, a mound of earth back in the valley, still fresh, marked by a rough-cut wooden cross. Fever had taken him quick, and with him had gone her protection, her place, her worth in the eyes of his kin. She was now an echo left behind, a shadow cast off. She whispered again, "Hush now, little one. Mama's here." But her voice cracked, and tears slid down her dust-stained face. Her mind flickered with a single, unbearable thought: what if no one came? What if this canyon became their grave as well? It was then, as twilight deepened into indigo, that she heard it, the slow, steady clop of hooves on stone. Her heart stuttered. She rose too fast, nearly stumbling as she clutched the baby to her chest. Through the dusky haze, a figure emerged, a rider astride a tall, dark horse, moving with the patience of one who knew both land and danger. The rider drew nearer, hat brim shadowing his face, coat heavy with dust of the trail. The horse snorted, breath steaming in the cooling air. Eliza felt both fear and hope crash inside her, fear that this man might be like her in-laws, cold and merciless, hope that perhaps he was not. He reined in a few paces away, studying her without a word. The silence stretched. Eliza's breath caught. She clutched the baby closer, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please, help us." The rider swung down from his saddle in a single slow motion. He was tall, shoulders worn from years of labor or battle. His boots struck the dirt with the weight of someone who carried his own ghosts. For a long moment, he stood, eyes unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. Then, without asking questions, without demanding reasons, he stepped forward. He knelt, studying the child wrapped in her arms. His hand, scarred and rough, reached out but stopped short, hovering in the space between them. Then, carefully, he tugged the quilt higher over the infant's head, shielding him from the wind. Still he said nothing. Only a nod, steady, deliberate. His silence was heavier than words, but not unkind. Eliza's knees weakened with relief. Tears blurred her sight. She allowed him, this stranger with no name, to guide her toward his horse. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing at all, placing her carefully upon the saddle. She clutched the child, heart pounding, eyes never leaving him. When he swung up behind her, the leather creaked under his weight. He gathered the reins, and with a click of his tongue, the horse turned, carrying them out of the canyon. The baby whimpered, then settled, as though soothed by the rhythm of hooves striking stone. The wind eased. Over the ridge, the faint glow of firelight shimmered in the distance. A cabin, lonely against the wilderness, offered promise where despair had nearly triumphed. Eliza leaned against the stranger's chest, feeling the steady rise and fall of breath, the warmth of another human being after a day of abandonment. Still he spoke no word. His silence was both a comfort and a mystery. As the canyon faded behind them, she wondered through her exhaustion, why had he stopped when all others would have ridden past? Why her, why now? The questions hung in the cool night air, unanswered, as the firelight drew nearer. What she knew was only this: survival had found her again, not through kin, nor charity, but through the hand of a silent man who carried no name. The cabin was small, built of rough-hewn logs darkened by years of wind and smoke. Its roof sagged a little, patched in places with cedar shakes that groaned when the night wind pressed against them. Yet, compared to the canyon where Eliza had been left, it was a fortress, 4 walls, a roof, and the faint warmth of fire seeping into her chilled bones. A single lantern burned on a wooden table, its light dancing across the room. Shadows stretched long against the walls, swaying with each flicker of flame. The scent of pine smoke mingled with the sharp tang of coffee. Eliza sat on the edge of a low bed in the corner, her child bundled in her arms. The baby's breathing was shallow but steady now, tiny chest rising and falling against the worn quilt. The stranger moved with slow, deliberate steps, as if every gesture weighed upon him. He placed a tin cup on the table, the steam of coffee rising like ghost breath. He broke a loaf of coarse bread, setting half near her without a word. His hands were calloused, scarred in places that spoke of more than farm work, the kind of marks left by rope, by blade, perhaps by fire. When he leaned to set down the bread, his sleeve shifted, and she glimpsed another scar running pale across his wrist. Her gaze shifted to the rifle propped against the doorframe. Its wood was worn smooth, polished by years of use. The barrel gleamed faintly in the lantern's glow, a reminder that violence lingered even here, in this cabin that smelled of safety. Eliza lowered her eyes, pressing her lips to her baby's temple. Grief swelled unbidden. In the quiet, memories pressed against her heart with cruel sharpness. She saw again her husband's face, pale and damp with fever, his hand clutching hers in the final hour. His breath had rattled like broken glass, and then it had stopped altogether. She had wept until her body gave no more tears. His kin had buried him quickly, a mound of earth under a crooked wooden cross. And scarcely a week later, they had turned on her. "You bring only hunger," they had said. "No man left to feed you. Best we put you where the land can decide." She remembered standing in the yard with her shawl drawn tight, begging them not to take her child from her arms. They had sneered, spat in the dust, and left her in the canyon. That cruelty burned inside her still, a wound deeper than the grave she had knelt beside. Her shoulders shook now, though she kept her sobs quiet so the baby might not stir. Across the room, the stranger sat in a rough cedar chair near the fire. His face was half turned toward the flames, half shadowed by the brim of his hat, which he had not removed. He drank his coffee in silence, his posture heavy, his eyes far away. Yet when the baby whimpered, his head turned sharply. His gaze lingered, not on her, but on the child, steady and unreadable. For a fleeting moment, she saw something flicker there, sorrow, maybe, or recognition, as if the sight of a newborn called forth some buried pain. Eliza clutched her baby tighter, unease and wonder mingling. Who was he, this man who had lifted her from death's doorstep without asking her name? Why did he look upon her child as though it stirred some old wound of his own? She dared to whisper into the quiet. "You've children of your own." His jaw tightened, but no sound came. His eyes returned to the fire. She waited, her heart thudding in the silence, but he gave no answer. Only the sound of logs shifting in the hearth filled the cabin. She sensed she had pressed against a wall too thick to breach. His silence was not cruel, nor dismissive. It was heavy, guarded, like a man who carried grief so vast it could not be spoken aloud. And yet, despite the wordlessness, she felt no judgment from him. He had not looked at her as her in-laws had, with contempt and blame. His silence was not rejection, it was survival. The baby stirred again, tiny fingers wriggling free of the quilt. The stranger's eyes caught the movement. For the briefest instant, his features softened, as though the flame had cracked through the armor of his face. Then the hardness returned, and he leaned back in his chair, gaze fixed once more on the fire. Eliza let out a long breath. Exhaustion weighed upon her body, but some small piece of her spirit lifted. Here in this cabin, in the presence of a nameless man who spoke nothing but offered shelter, she was not despised. She was not abandoned. She lowered herself onto the bed fully, lying beside her child, pulling the quilt over them both. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, but it was more comfort than she had believed she would find again. The lantern hissed softly as the flame licked low. Her eyelids grew heavy. She thought of her husband one last time, then of her in-laws' cruel faces. But as sleep crept near, her final thought was of the stranger in the chair, silent, scarred, and yet steady as stone. She wondered if he, too, had once been cast out, if he, too, had knelt by a grave that hollowed him out. She wondered if his silence was not emptiness, but the only language left to a man who had lost more than words could carry. The fire crackled. The baby sighed in his sleep. And as darkness folded around her, Eliza's fear eased for the first time in many months. She did not trust him fully, not yet. But she no longer feared The storm arrived without warning. At first, it was only the restless sigh of wind through the pines, rattling loose shingles on the cabin roof. Then came the low growl of thunder, rolling across the canyon like the voice of some ancient spirit. By the time Eliza rose from her narrow bed, clutching her baby close, the sky outside had broken wide open. Sheets of rain lashed against the windows, turning the glass into trembling mirrors. The roof shuddered beneath each gust, the timbers groaning as though the weight of the storm might splinter them apart. The baby stirred, then cried, a thin wail at first, but quickly growing into sharp, frantic sobs that pierced the noise of thunder. Eliza rocked him in her arms, whispering soothing words, though her own heart beat wild and unsteady. Each lightning strike painted the room in harsh white for the space of a heartbeat, throwing long shadows of chair, table, and rifle against the log walls. The stranger moved quickly but not in panic. He fed more wood to the fire, coaxing flames to burn higher against the damp air pressing in through the chinks. Then, without asking, he crossed the room and held out his arms. For a moment Eliza hesitated, maternal instinct clutching fiercely to her child. But something in his gaze, steady, quiet, weathered, calmed her. She placed the baby into his scarred hands. He settled into the cedar rocking chair by the hearth, its joints creaking softly beneath his weight. With a slowness that felt almost reverent, he began to rock, the rhythm steady and certain. The baby's cries faltered, then softened, lulled by the motion and the warmth of firelight. Eliza watched, astonishment rising in her chest. She had expected hardness from this silent man, expected only steel and solitude. Instead she saw gentleness, rough hands cradling fragile life with the same care one might hold a sparrow. The storm battered on. Wind howled like wolves through the canyon mouth, and rain hammered the roof in relentless sheets. But inside the cabin, time seemed to pause. The man's silhouette swayed with the chair, the baby pressed against his chest. Each time lightning lit the room, Eliza saw more of him than she had before. The sharp line of his jaw. The deep hollows beneath his eyes. Scars etched like pale rivers across his skin. His face was not young, but not old either, shaped by years of sun, wind, and sorrow. He was a man carved from the land itself, weather-beaten and worn, yet unbroken. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt something stir that was not despair. It was not trust, not yet, but awe, a recognition that this man was bound to the earth in a way she could not name. The baby whimpered once more, and the man hushed him softly, not with words, but with a low hum, a sound so faint Eliza almost thought she imagined it. Then thunder cracked again, drowning all else, and she pulled the quilt tighter about her shoulders. Hours dragged by, measured only by the rise and fall of the storm. Eliza drifted between exhaustion and wakefulness, her eyes never leaving the figure in the rocking chair. At last, near dawn, the thunder rolled farther off, the rain softened to a drizzle, and silence seeped back into the canyon. When Eliza stepped outside with the child nestled against her breast, the world was washed clean. Mist hung low, clinging to the trees. Water trickled down the rocks, gathering in rivulets that ran toward the canyon floor. She drew a deep breath of the damp air, grateful simply to stand beneath a sky that had not shattered after all. Then she froze. Not 20 paces from the cabin door, the ground bore the clear imprint of moccasin tracks. They wound between the wet stones, fresh and sharp-edged where rain had not yet filled them. Her breath caught in her chest. She knew enough to recognize what they were. Apache. Fear rushed through her veins like cold water. She looked back toward the cabin, expecting to see the stranger already reaching for the rifle propped by the door. Instead, she found him kneeling in the mud beside the prints, his fingers brushing lightly over them. He did not seize the weapon, did not curse or call for battle. He traced the tracks as though reading a language written upon the earth itself. The silence between them was broken only by the dripping of water from the eaves. Eliza's pulse pounded. She clutched her baby closer, her voice little more than a whisper. They were here. He looked up at her, eyes steady, rainwater running down his jaw. He gave a single nod, not of fear, not even of warning, but of acknowledgement. Then he returned his gaze to the earth. His hand pressed against the soil, almost reverent, as if paying respect to the presence of those who had passed. Something in that quiet act unsettled her. She had lived among settlers all her life, taught to fear the people of the land, taught they were enemies. Yet this man, this silent stranger, did not meet the tracks with hatred. He met them with respect, even understanding. Eliza shivered though the rain had eased. She realized then that he was not merely a wanderer who had stumbled upon her fate in the canyon. He was something else, a man shaped by this land in ways she could not yet comprehend. He belonged to it, carried its scars, and perhaps its secrets. For the first time, she wondered if his silence was not only grief, but knowledge of the kind of life lived on the edges of two worlds, where settlers and natives both claimed ground, and men like him walked a line between. Her fear did not vanish, but it shifted. Awe crept in alongside it. She tightened her arms around the baby and watched as the stranger rose from the mud, rain glistening on his coat. He said nothing, as always, but when his eyes met hers, she felt a message pass between them all the same. This land is dangerous. But you are not alone. Days passed with a rhythm both fragile and uneasy. Eliza rose early, though her body ached from restless nights. She swept the hearth, boiled water over the fire, and prepared what little food there was, beans, coarse bread, the occasional rabbit the stranger brought back from his traps. Her hands trembled from fatigue, but she pressed on. The baby demanded nearly every breath of her strength. His cries filled the cabin in the quiet hours, and though she hushed him with murmured lullabies, weariness dug deep hollows under her eyes. The stranger kept to his work as if silence itself were his trade. He repaired broken tools, hammering iron against a makeshift anvil. He split logs in the yard, the thud of the axe carrying through the canyon walls. Sometimes he sat on the porch carving wood, whittling shapes that had no purpose except to give his hands labor. He never asked for thanks, never sought her company. Yet the cabin was too small to escape the press of his presence. Tension simmered between them, not born of anger but of wound and weight. Two souls bound under one roof, neither whole, each carrying shadows they could not yet name aloud. She wanted to ask his story, but fear held her back, fear that her questions would shatter what fragile peace existed. One evening, as the sun slipped low and painted the canyon walls in blood-red light, the child whimpered in her arms. At first it seemed no more than hunger, but soon his breaths grew shallow, his tiny chest rising with effort. Heat burned against her skin when she pressed her lips to his forehead. Fever. Elijah, she whispered, the name she had given him after his father's death. The baby's skin glistened with sweat, and panic clutched her heart. She tried rocking him, singing softly, but the fever only climbed. His breaths rattled weakly, and terror stole the strength from her knees. The stranger crossed the room at once, his eyes narrowing as he studied the child. Without a word, he moved to the rifle by the door, but only to push it aside. He pulled on his coat, lifted his hat, and strode into the dusk. Eliza clutched the baby, calling after him, "Where are you going?" He turned, his face half in shadow. "Herbs," he said simply, voice low and rough, the first word she had heard him utter in days. Then he mounted his horse and rode into the gathering night. Hours passed like years. Eliza rocked her child beside the fire, tears blurring her sight. The storm had left the air damp and cold, and she feared every gust of wind might carry the stranger away for good. She prayed, not knowing to whom, whispering bargains into the smoke of the hearth. At last, hoofbeats broke the silence. She rushed to the door just as the stranger dismounted. His coat was torn, his knuckles bloodied, his face bruised as though he had crossed more than just rough country. In his hand he carried a small bundle wrapped in deerskin, tied with a strip of rawhide. He entered without a word, set the bundle upon the table, and unwrapped it. Inside lay herbs, green and fragrant, gathered with care. He motioned for water. Together they steeped the leaves, and when the bitter brew was ready, he coaxed a few drops between the infant's lips. The hours that followed stretched taut with fear. The child whimpered, then stilled, his breaths shallow but steadier. Eliza pressed her face into the quilt, tears spilling freely. Relief washed over her like rain upon dry earth. She turned to the stranger, her voice breaking. "You risked your life for him. Why?" He sat heavily in the cedar chair, his bruised hand resting upon his knee. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time she saw the storm within them, sorrow deep as the canyon itself. His lips parted, but only a whisper emerged. "Because no child should be left without breath." She held his gaze, trembling, searching. "Tell me your name." For a long moment he did not move. The fire crackled, casting shadows across his face. Then he shook his head slowly, the brim of his hat dipping low. His voice came rough, like gravel underfoot. "Names bring trouble." The weight of those words hung heavy in the room. She felt the truth of them, though she did not understand the full measure. His silence was not emptiness, it was armor. To give a name was to open a door he had barred long ago. Eliza lowered her eyes to her child, now sleeping with color returning faintly to his cheeks. Gratitude swelled in her chest, tangled with confusion. This man owed her nothing, owed her son even less, yet he had faced night and danger to return with life in his hands. Her in-laws had cast her aside, naming her a burden. But this stranger, nameless and wounded, had chosen to protect her without question. For the first time, she began to understand, survival did not come from blood ties, nor from names written in a family Bible. It came from the acts of those who chose to stand beside you when the night pressed hardest. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders and whispered, though she knew he would not answer, "Then I will not ask again." He nodded once, slowly, as though granting her the dignity of her promise. The fire burned lower, shadows stretching long across the floor. The baby slept. And in that silence, heavy but no longer empty, something fragile began to grow, not trust yet, but the seed of it, pressed deep into the soil of shared survival. The night had fallen still, so still that even the canyon wind seemed to hold their breath. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting its glow across the cabin walls. Eliza sat in the corner with her baby pressed against her chest, humming softly while his small breaths warmed the hollow of her neck. The stranger whittled in silence, the steady scrape of blade against wood the only other sound. It was in that fragile quiet that the crunch of hooves reached them. At first faint, then closer. The rhythm of more than one rider. Eliza's song broke in her throat. Fear clamped down hard. She knew the cadence of those steps, the hard stomp of boots against stirrup, the voices that soon followed. Her in-laws. The horses drew up outside the cabin, snorting in the cold. A harsh knock split the silence, followed by the guttural voice of her brother-in-law, sharp as broken glass. "Eliza. You've no place here. Come out, girl, before we drag you out. You shame the name of our kin." The baby stirred, whimpering. Eliza pressed her shawl tighter around him, her heart pounding. Shame, that word had been her prison since the day they cast her aside. Yet tonight, with the fire at her back and the stranger's quiet presence beside her, something inside her shifted. The man set down his carving. He rose, slow and steady, and took the rifle from where it leaned against the door. He did not speak. He did not need to. His silence was a shield, heavy and certain. The door rattled as another fist pounded against it. "Come now, girl. We'll not ask again. That bastard child brings nothing but hunger. You belong with us, where you can work for your keep." The insult burned through her like hot iron. Bastard child. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, fighting the wave of humiliation that always followed their cruelty. But when she looked at her son, his tiny face flushed with fever still not long past, the shame did not stick. Something else rose instead, defiance. The stranger lifted the bar from the door and stepped outside. Eliza followed him, clutching the baby to her chest. The night opened wide around them. Firelight from a torch cast long shadows across the yard. 3 men sat astride horses, their faces twisted with disdain. The brother-in-law spat into the dirt, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. "She comes with us," he snarled. "Or we'll see her left in the canyon again, this time without the brat." The words struck like blows, but Eliza did not flinch. The stranger moved forward, rifle steady at his side, his stance unyielding. He said nothing. The silence between him and the mounted men stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. One rider laughed. "What's this?" The widow's found herself a new dog to guard her. "You'll regret it, drifter. Best step aside. Ain't your fight." The stranger's jaw tightened, but his voice remained locked away. He lifted the rifle, slow as a rising tide, until its barrel gleamed in the firelight. The laughter died. The horses shifted uneasily. Eliza's brother-in-law spat again. "You think to scare me with silence? She belongs to us. Always did." Eliza's voice broke free before fear could choke it. "No." The word rang out, sharp, louder than the crackle of torch fire, louder even than her pounding heart. She took a step forward, baby in her arms, her shawl pulled tight. Her eyes met theirs, unflinching. "I do not belong to you. You left me to die." "You left him." She looked at her son, then back to the men, her voice steady now, filled with something new. "And we lived." For the first time in months, she felt her spine straighten, her dignity unbowed. Shame slipped from her shoulders like an old garment. The brother-in-law's face twisted with rage. He reached for his rifle. In that instant, the stranger moved, faster than a rattlesnake's strike. His rifle leveled, steady and unshaken, firelight catching the scars across his face. They returned inside together. The baby stirred but did not cry. The fire burned low, casting its glow across the cedar chair, the quilt, the rifle set once more against the door. Eliza lowered herself onto the bed, still trembling, but her heart was different now. Stronger. No longer chained by shame. She had spoken, she had stood, and she had not broken. Across the room, the stranger sat once more in his chair. He leaned back, rifle resting across his knees. The scars on his hands glowed faintly in the firelight. His eyes, though weary, carried something she had not seen before, recognition. Silence filled the cabin again, but it was changed. It was no longer the silence of grief or distance. It was alive with something unspoken, shared between two souls who had faced the night together and found fire between them. Dawn broke pale and uncertain, spilling weak light over the canyon. The air was sharp with the smell of damp earth from the night's rain, and a thin mist clung low along the creek bed. Eliza stood outside the cabin with her child in her arms, shawl pulled snug around her shoulders. The baby stirred softly, warm against her breast, his tiny hand curling around the edge of the quilt. The stranger tightened the saddle cinch on his horse, movement slow, deliberate. His rifle was strapped across his back, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He had not spoken since the night of the confrontation, but his silence no longer pressed upon her with the weight of emptiness. She had begun to understand it, to feel its meaning. When he turned, ready to help her mount, Eliza shook her head. Her voice carried softly in the morning stillness. No. Today, I ride by my own will. He regarded her for a long moment, eyes unreadable. Then he gave a single nod, lifted her onto the saddle with child in arms, and swung up behind. Together they set out, hooves striking rhythm into the damp earth. The ride into town was quiet but not heavy. The canyon walls gave way to rolling plain, the mist thinning until sunlight burned gold across the grass. Birds rose in startled flocks as they passed, scattering into the brightening sky. Eliza's heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. She was done with hiding. Done with shame. By the time they reached the town, smoke curled from chimneys, and shop doors swung open to the day's trade. People looked up as the riders entered, eyes narrowing, whispers rising. The sight of a widow returning, child in arms, accompanied by a nameless drifter with rifle on his back, stirred talk as quick as wildfire. Faces peered from behind curtains, men paused on the steps of the saloon, women clutched their aprons. Eliza kept her gaze forward. Her stepson's widow's shawl hung heavy across her shoulders, but she wore it not as a badge of grief, but as armor. She carried herself with quiet dignity, though every whisper sought to strip it from her. Her in-laws appeared at the end of the street. The brother-in-law who had left her in the canyon strode forward, his face twisted with contempt. So you crawl back, do you? A widow who can't keep her place. A burden on all. The words cut, but they no longer pierced. Eliza's voice rose clear, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. You left me to die. You left him, she lifted her child higher, her voice unbreaking now, to die. And yet we live. A hush fell across the street. The brother-in-law sneered, spitting into the dust. You speak bold for a woman who should be grateful we gave her a roof at all. She stepped forward, her feet steady, her shawl shifting in the breeze. Grateful? You gave me nothing. You gave me abandonment. You gave me shame. But the land, the storm, and a man who owed me nothing gave me life. I will not hide again. The townsfolk shifted, their whispers dying into silence. Men who had looked away before lowered their eyes now. Women clutched their children closer, shame flickering across their faces as if her words had reached into their own unspoken fears. The brother-in-law faltered, his bravado crumbling beneath the weight of her truth. He turned as if to speak again, but the stranger stepped forward, rifle steady across his back, his presence alone silencing further insult. Eliza looked at him then, really looked, her heart steady in her chest. For months she had lived beneath others' judgment, bound by the chains of their silence and cruelty. Now she spoke, and her words rang louder than rifles. She turned back to her in-laws. I lay no curse on you. The truth is curse enough. I was left to die. But I live. And you will live knowing that. The silence of the street was heavy as stone. Slowly, her brother-in-law stepped back. The crowd parted, not for him, but for her. Eliza lifted her chin. She felt no triumph of vengeance, only the steady fire of dignity reclaimed. She turned toward her horse, where the stranger waited. As she reached him, she whispered low, so only he could hear. You've given me life twice now. Yet I still do not know your name. For a moment, he was still. His eyes lowered, shadowed beneath the brim. Then, in a voice that was rough but steady, he answered. Caleb. The name fell like a prayer into the dust, a word carried not with pride, but with release. Eliza nodded once, holding the sound in her heart. She did not speak it aloud, but it burned warm upon her lips. Caleb mounted, then reached to steady her as she lifted the baby into her arms once more. They rode out together, the morning sun spilling gold across their path, dust rising behind them in the light. The town faded into distance. The canyon opened before them, no longer a place of abandonment but of survival. The baby nestled between them, eyes closed in peace. Eliza leaned back against Caleb's steady frame, not as a woman rescued, but as a woman who had chosen her path. Caleb's silence wrapped around them, but it was no longer a wall. It was a home, a space in which words were not always needed. Two broken souls, bound not by fate, nor by blood, but by choice. The dawn stretched wide before them, and for the first time since grief had stolen her world, Eliza felt she was riding not into exile, but into the beginnings of something that might yet be called home.